Reaction to these proposals is Adam Wagner, a barrister specialising in human rights and editor of the UK Human Rights blog. Thank you very much for joining us. I mean, this is clearly about elections, isn't it, as well as legal issues. But from the legal perspective, is what the Conservatives are proposing workable?
Well, I think it's important to make clear that the title of this document is Protecting Human Rights in the UK, and the reality is what these proposals will do is significantly reduce those protections, not just for certain groups but for everybody. They're not workable in the form they currently take. There's a huge misunderstanding, probably willful, of our international obligations. There's very significant dissonance between how the rights are presented in the document and how the European Court will understand them. And as Dominic Grieve has already said, they're simply incoherent, and it's no surprise that he lost his job as the only vocal lawyer left in government.
Adam, we have literally just received a statement from the Council of Europe on these Conservative proposals. Let me just take you through the detail of this before returning to the discussion with Adam. The Council of Europe says it takes note of these proposals by the Conservative Party. We also take note they are not draft legislation. As they stand, the proposals are not consistent with the European Convention on Human Rights, and the Council of Europe also says, as we have said previously, it is inconceivable that the UK, as a human rights leader and founding country of this organisation, would leave the Council of Europe. So, very interesting statement there from the Council of Europe. I mean, Adam, just give me your reaction to that initially.
It's totally unsurprising, because the Council of Europe relies on the goodwill of states who sign up for the European Convention, that they will do what it says in very clear terms in that convention. They will abide by judgments. What these proposals say is that the Parliament will do the opposite. It will treat those judgments as advisory. So how could the Council of Europe, if these proposals become concrete, support that?
But the Justice Secretary, Chris Grayling, this morning is saying that the Conservative Party's proposals would be a democratic check on human rights legislation. And he is saying that the courts have used this human rights legislation to make judgments on areas of life that never would have been conceived of in the original Convention on Human Rights. And, you know, clearly there are a huge number of people who don't want to see human rights law being used to allow convicted criminals and terrorists being told they can stay in the UK because of their right to a family life, for example.
Well, just taking the points about the democratic check on human rights, it's just getting it the wrong way around. Human rights are a check on democracy. And that's always been the point. That was the point the founding fathers, including Winston Churchill, were making after the Second World War.
But isn't the law being used to allow people who shouldn't have these rights perhaps extended to them, a lot of people would argue, to allow them, for example, to stay in the UK or to gain some other benefit? Isn't the law being twisted?
Well, if you believe that the criminals who have served their sentences have no human rights, because they have committed a crime.
I'm talking about criminals who haven't served their sentences necessarily, who perhaps have been jailed.
Prisoners who are jailed serve their jail sentences. No prisoner who is jailed has ever been able to say, well, I must be prevented from being deported because of my human rights. This applies. The judgments which the Justice Secretary gets so animated about apply to people who have served their sentences and there is an attempt to deport them.
Just very briefly, looking at it from the other perspective, would this undermine the convention itself if the UK was to pull away from it?
It absolutely would, because look at Russia. They could say, well, you know, a supposedly founding father of the human rights movement, the UK, has said we only have to treat these judgments as advisory. So when Russia gets told to pay billions of pounds to people it's abused, they can just say, well, we don't fancy that because democratic sovereignty, or whatever the words that Chris Grayling uses. The reality is this is a power grab by MPs from citizens. They want their power back. They gave it away with the Human Rights Act. They want it back. So when they talk about sovereignty, they're really talking about power.
OK, Adam Wagner.